Ditte Juul-Jørgensen is a director in the European Commission, and she is in charge of WTO questions and dispute settlements inside WTO. But as I mentioned in the Finnish part, you're also expert on investment protection issues as well. Ditte will give us a bit wider picture where we are in trade liberalization. Actually, WTO released yesterday, if I remember right, new figures where they anticipated that trade will grow, world trade will grow this year by 4.7%. The positive issue is that this figure is the double compared to the previous year. But with this 4.7, we are still clearly below the 20-year average, which is over 5.3%. And above the TTIP time schedule, Minister referred to the tank wording which was used by Obama, if I remember right, but we may speak more about a tanker, so that this will not go that fast in a case. But Ditte, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having invited me here. Apologies that I cannot speak in Finnish, but for your questions later, English or Swedish will be fine, but again, Finnish unfortunately not. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to participate in your debate here and to hear comments and questions on European trade policy. As Marco said, I would like to address the relation between the WTO, the multilateral trade policy and our objectives there, and in particular TTIP among the many negotiations that we currently have ongoing. There has been so much attention to TTIP since negotiations were launched. Understandably, it is the largest bilateral negotiation process that we have engaged in yet. It is a negotiation between the world's two largest trading partners, so it will have a global impact in addition to the impact on our markets and on the American markets. And but we should not nonetheless forget the multilateral trading system, which remains a central element and the backbone of both our international trade relations, but also of European trade policy. Despite the fact that we are engaged in a number of negotiating processes globally for free trade agreements, and we have a number of free trade agreements in place, it's still a fact that the majority of ongoing global trade is governed by the multilateral trading system, by the rules embodied in the World Trade Organization and the GATT agreement, the other agreements in there relating to trade in goods and services, and a number of rules areas. There are good reasons for the centrality of the multilateral trading system. The WTO has 159 members. It is the only organization that is capable of both developing rules that apply almost universally across the world, but also rules that can be applied more or less uniformly with a strong monitoring system and with a very strong and active enforcement system in the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. It's also a fact, I think, that for enterprises, trading under multilateral rules is infinitely simpler than trading under a number of different rules under different free trade agreements. So again, there are very good reasons that we should continue to engage in the multilateral trading system and to seek liberalization and rulemaking outcomes in the multilateral system. Marco mentioned the trade growth this year, or the expected trade growth, and I think it is interesting to look back over the last couple of years that despite the very significant global economic and financial crisis, the growth in protectionism has not been as significant as one could have feared. It certainly hasn't matched the protectionism of earlier crises, and that is partly due to the strong monitoring and engagement and commitment among WTO members to handle this. I would like to say a bit about the current state of play in the multilateral trading system and WTO negotiations, and after that say something about the relation between those negotiations and TTIP negotiations. For the EU, the strengthening of the multilateral trading system is an objective, as is the conclusion of the Doha Development Agenda. And I think if TTIP requires a tanker of gas, the Doha Development Agenda will require, or has required already, several tankers of gas. But hopefully we are in the last tanker, or the last tanker but one, before we can bring results. There is a degree of optimism, and there's a high level of activity in Geneva and the World Trade Organization, again, after the successful WTO ministerial conference in December, which brought good results in that it brought agreement on, or consensus on, a trade facilitation agreement for all WTO members. This is the first agreement agreed between WTO members since the conclusion of the Uruguay round, and that is quite significant. So the agreement is significant in itself in that it will help lower costs and facilitate trade, but it's also significant because it is a first closure within the Doha Development Agenda negotiations. The other key outcome from the ministerial in Bali in December is the fact that members committed to setting out a work program on how to move forward on the Doha Development Agenda negotiations. By the end of this year, we should have a work program in place. It will not be easy. We've been at these negotiations for the last 13 years, and some of the very fundamental underlying questions that caused us difficulties in the past, and particularly in 2008 when we were very close to finalizing. Those difficulties and differences are still out there. There are some fundamental questions on the role of the major emerging countries, the changes in global trade flows. How do we reflect those in negotiations? How do we reflect the different status and place in the world economy of different countries that are generally, as a group, referred to as developing countries, but that have very significant differences among them in terms of competitiveness and integration in the global trading system. It is clear from discussions in Geneva, and discussions are currently ongoing with a view to establishing a work programme, it is clear that there will be a need to adjust expectations. If we all stick to our positions that we have been sticking to over the last 13 years, there will not be progress. It will not be possible to close. So we do need to have more realistic ambitions, not low ambitions, but adjusted and realistic. It's also clear that in order to move forward, there will have to be a balance between the agriculture issues, both agriculture market access and rules in relation to agricultural subsidies and support. So between that agriculture pillar and the non-agricultural pillar, industrial market access, as well as market access for services. There's also an important rules component of negotiations. I mentioned agricultural subsidies, but there are also subsidies in other areas that are of increasing concern in other parts of the world. There are problems with transparency, there are problems of subsidies to state-owned enterprises, and those issues are important to address as well. As I said, in seeking the balance between the different pillars, it will be important to address the changes in global trade flows and the fact that some countries that had just joined as members when negotiations were launched are now significant global players and have a different role to play. The fact that we are working on on this work program, and the fact that the multilateral process in Geneva is active, means that we are, as part of the European trade policy, effectively pursuing three parallel tracks. We have the multilateral process aiming to close the Doha Development Agenda. We have a number of plurilateral processes. The Information Technology Agreement revision is one of the important ones, where there has been a high degree of activity. We remain committed to closing the Information Technology Agreement, but it is still challenging on some issues and some partners. And there is the agreement in the Trade and Services Agreement, which is a plurilateral negotiation as well. And then we have a number of bilateral negotiations ongoing, TTIP being the most significant one, but we're also negotiating with Japan, with a number of ASEAN countries, and re-engaging with Mercosur. So a very busy trade negotiation agenda, and I would like to say a few words about the link between the multilateral trading system, those processes, and the TTIP. I've mentioned, I think, even a couple of times that we have negotiated in the Doha Development Agenda and WTO for 13 years. It is an ambitious agenda, but I think it's also clear that achieving results multilaterally is challenging and it takes time. In order to be able to address today's challenges, to reflect the changes in the global economy, but also to address issues that have arisen since the Doha talks were launched 13 years ago, it is relevant and appropriate to look at bilateral agreements to complement what can be done multilaterally, to go further in areas where we may have more in common with certain WTO members than with others, and thereby try to develop the global trade agenda to become more forward-looking, more dynamic, and a fairer reflection of where the world is today. And this is where, for example, TTIP, but also EU-Japan negotiations come in. They address a wider set of issues that we've been able to address multilaterally. Your minister mentioned investment as an example of an area where we have tried in the past, many years ago, to engage in negotiations multilaterally. There was resistance to that, but that is an issue that can be addressed bilaterally and addressed in an effective manner. The objective of these bilateral initiatives is therefore not to undermine the multilateral process or the multilateral system, but rather to complement and also to prepare the ground for future multilateral engagement by developing rules bilaterally, setting a high standard, a high level of ambition to seek to influence global processes going forward. And TTIP is an ideal setting to do that. It is not simple. There are differences transatlantically, but it is also true that we share a number of principles and interests in terms of how we build trade relations globally. In terms of the impact of the relation between TTIP and the multilateral trading system, I think it's important to recall that our ability to deliver and to liberalize in the context of TTIP would send a clear signal of our joint commitment to market opening. We should be able to address complex regulatory issues and provide new focus for negotiations, but also, as I said, start building a platform from which we can engage with other partners as well in future. The agreement between the EU and the US is expected to set a standard for future agreements and for the development of global rules. It's a lab where we can explore, fill gaps in the global rule set and try to develop those in a manner to influence global rules later. Regulatory convergence is an area where we have not been able to engage beyond the multilateral standard setting, but it's been an area where we've not been able to engage multilaterally beyond that. And if you look at the global economy, you would have standards in EU or US applied by the EU or the US having a significant impact globally, and the fact that there will be a degree of convergence and engagement there should make global trade easier, not just for the EU and US, but also for other countries. As I mentioned, we will be able to go to a higher level of ambition. We will have more ambitious tariff cuts bilaterally in TTIP, whereas multilateral trade negotiations have typically consolidated liberalization rather than bringing it forward. And the same, as I mentioned, on the regulatory cooperation, an area where we can go further. Maybe a further word on investment, which has attracted significant attention as part of the TTIP negotiations, not because it's the first time anyone is negotiating investment agreements. As your minister mentioned, there's a large number of bilateral investment agreements globally, but this is one of the first negotiations that the EU is handling. And because of the size of the investment relationship, has impact on both sides and meets interest on both sides of the Atlantic. Because there is no prospect of multilateral negotiations on investment, the only way to advance an investment agenda is to do that through bilateral negotiations. Negotiations with the US on this particular issue is also an opportunity to improve rules, to modernize rules. We're going through a review process with the public consultation. We hope to have comments and input and views that will help us review and make sure that we get the best possible model for how we negotiate investment issues, and that we find the right balance between investment protection and the right to regulate of governments, but also with an enforcement mechanism that is accountable and transparent and credible, so as to build an investment agreement model for the future, and starting with the US, where there are a number of commonalities, is a strong platform to engage from. Another point on investment that I think is important to bear in mind is the fact that a number of member states have investment agreements in place with the US. And if we are to create a level playing field for European investors in the US and for US investors throughout Europe, it is an advantage to have a common set of investment protection rules in place. What we hope is to be able to develop good investment rules with TTIP and thereby set a model that would be relevant also for future. So we do look forward to your input in the public consultations that are ongoing to help us do that. I mentioned the different plurilateral initiatives and multilateral initiatives and the complementarity between the different models. It means effectively that we have in the short to medium term an extremely intense and busy negotiating agenda, both bilaterally, plurilaterally, and with closure of the DDA. We do hope to come back to the WTO. We hope to be able to establish a work program with other WTO members at the end of this year, so as to allow active negotiations over the coming couple of years. A realistic time frame for multilateral negotiations and for closing the DDA would seem to be the ministerial conference that would take place in 2017. There is an earlier ministerial conference already at the end of next year, but it would seem very challenging to close on the important issues that are part of the WTO negotiations already then. And I think we have to factor into the multilateral negotiations the fact that many WTO members and significant WTO members are negotiating bilaterally, so there will be a question of both handling these processes in parallel and looking at the sequencing, at what is the optimal sequencing of the different negotiations in order to bring success both in our bilateral processes as well as in the multilateral trading system. If you look at it much longer term, it's clear that there will be, and here I come back to my starting point, it's clear that there will be an interest in coming back to the multilateral trading system, liberalization, consolidation, rules, monitoring, transparency, enforcement, is in the longer term more interesting and relevant and simpler in a multilateral setting. But the multilateral trading system and the multilateral negotiations also need a bit of support and complement from other negotiations and other rulemaking processes in order to help nudge that multilateral process forward. So we hope to see over the coming couple of years and also in the longer term constructive or complementary processes between those bilateral negotiations and the multilateral negotiations in the WTO. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ditte, for this very, very clear insight. The message can be easily shared. The multilateral way is also the Finnish way, always when it's possible. When it's not, we have to use the bilateral tools and with these tools go even further than we could go with the multilateral way. But now, Ditte, if I may ask you to take your seat, because you get translation there, and then I call you back to the main table when we have the discussion.